No, Mr. McIntosh.
My Lord, the next witness is Professor Mark Wilcox.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
Now, as you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McIntosh, sitting opposite to you. But first, understand you're prepared to affirm.
Yes, please.
Sitting where you are, would you please repeat the words I'm about to say? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly and sincerely, truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Professor Wilcox. I'm about to hand you over to Mr. McIntosh, but can I remind you of the need for us all to hear what you say and perhaps speak a little more slowly than you might otherwise, and a little bit at a little higher volume.
I'll try.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, my Lord. Professor, firstly, can I ask your full name?
It's, Professor Mark Harvey Wilcox.
And did you produce 2 statements for the inquiry?
Yes, I did.
And are you willing to adopt those as part of your evidence?
Yes.
Thank you. What's your current post that you hold, Professor?
I'll try and be brief because it's a bit complicated because I work for several different organisations. My prime organisation that pays me is the University of Leeds, but I hold positions at the Leeds Teaching Hospitals, which is affiliated to the University of Leeds and vice versa. But I also work 2 days a week for NHS England in a national capacity as an antimicrobial resistance and infection prevention and control expert.
Thank you. And we want to ask you about your role in the case notes review. And you've given an extensive statement about that. And we've just heard the evidence of Miss Evans, a member of the panel. I'm not proposing to revisit areas that I discussed with her. I'm not a few of them, but most of them. What I really wanted to do was just to check a few things with you that she explained. If we want to find an explanation about why you, as an expert panel, the 3 of you, her, yourself, and Professor Stevens, produced a particular conclusion about the probability of an infection linked to the environment for a particular patient, where would we find the rationale for a particular patient or an infection?
The rationale will lie within the individual case records and our assessment form of each of those records. There would be another part way of doing that through the letters that were sent to each of the families, copies of which were sent to GGC if and only if the families agreed for such copies to be sent. And we don't, to this day, I don't know who did and who did not agree to that process.
So there wasn't a automatic transmission of those letters to NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde?
To the best of my knowledge, no.
Now that means that we need to ask you some questions about your methodology. Yes. And also about some criticisms. And I'm going to focus initially on the microbiology. But before I get there, I just wanted to, I noticed that in the report, reference is made to what are referred to as the Bradford Hill postulates. And that in the comments made on the draft, Greater Glasgow and Clyde suggested that this should receive some weight or prominence in your methodology. And we've been learning as lawyers a little bit about Bradford Hill, what he thought. But to what extent did those ideas of epidemiology form a part in your decision making?
So you'll have to direct me to, it's only loosely familiar to me, the term you're referring to. It's not an accepted term.
Right. In that case, give me a moment and I will open up the document.
Thank you.
So if we can go to It's within one of the commentaries on it from GGC, and not the report itself, which is at bundle 27. Sorry. I'll come back to that. I think it's the easiest to do rather than wasting time at the moment. What I want to do before we do that is just to discuss the use of whole genome sequencing, which is something that you discuss in a section of the report in section 8.3.1 of the overview report, which is bundle 6, page 1069. And if we can go there. And in this section, I read it as a discussion of the use of bacterial typing, which on the next page turns in the third paragraph to the use of whole genome sequencing. Now, what expertise do you have in this field of whole genome sequencing?
I've been practicing as a consultant for nearly 30 years, and for probably the last 15 to 20 of those, as this technique became available, I've been used to using this technique. I've authored papers in New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, and so on that have used this technology.
And what, in a sense, do you understand was the suggested use that whole genome sequencing should be put to in the sort of exercise the case notes review was carrying out?
Well, we were reviewing any of the data available to us, and as whole genome sequencing data are viewed in general as the ultimate fingerprinting technique, the equivalent of a fingerprint, literally, to determine relatedness. So can you rule in or rule out relatedness? Then we were interested to examine any of the data, whole genome sequencing data that were available. And we met during the later part of the course of our case note review online with GGC personnel, microbiologists, to view what whole genome sequencing data they had.
And which microbiologists did you speak to?
Professor Leonard, Alistair Leonard. I can't remember who else was there, whether it was just Alistair, but certainly he did most of the talking. Right.
And did the work that he reported focus on 3 particular groups of microorganisms?
It did, yes.
And what were those 3?
Stenotrophomonas, Enterobacter, and Cupria vidus.
And if we look at your conclusion, or I'm not sure if conclusion is the right word, but your text here on page 1070, what ultimately was your response to the suggestion that the work that Professor Leonard had done would assist you in your task?
Okay, so it's only partially on this page, and I think it goes into the next 1 or 2 pages from memory, where I authored this part of the report. We, in turn, with those 3 groups of microorganisms, I went through the data that was available, essentially to look at the robustness of the analysis that had been carried out. The most convincing evidence for a relationship between the environment and patient infections was for Cupria vidus. I note there's actually been a publication, a peer-reviewed publication from GGC and other authors on that issue, those cases. That was published in 2021. For the other 2 groups, Enterobacter and Stenotrophomonas, there are issues with the analysis that mean that it is not possible to conclude with any certainty that the environment was not linked to the patient infections. I realise there's several negatives there, but
So in the point that could it be the point that's attempted to be made is that by analysing the relationships, and we'll come back to what that means in a moment,
yes,
between isolates from patients, isolates in the environment, one can both draw a conclusion of how closely related those samples are, and from that, say, Professor Leonard and others, that you can then draw another conclusion that there is not a connection between various samples.
yes. Well, I disagree with those conclusions, because there are some very clear omissions, drawbacks, limitations to the way the analysis has been performed.
And is this what you're setting out in these few pages of the report?
It is. That's the start of it. There is more detail behind it, but yes, that's what I attempted to do
Now,
for those three groups.
Clearly we can read it, but as non-experts, it's often easier to read something when you understand the core of the point. What is the core of the point that you're trying to make in these few pages?
So the first and really most fundamental issue is, have you fingerprinted, whole genome sequenced, all the relevant isolates at your disposal? And if we look for at Stenotrophomonas, for example, a third of the isolates causing bloodstream infections in the children, so that's 8 of 23, were not included in the analysis.
Now, you've said that. Obviously, that detail is mentioned, I think, in your text at the top of page 1071.
Yes.
But what I wanted to do was try and connect that to some evidence that we've already heard. So when you arrived this morning, I had instructed to give to you a copy of Professor Leonard's report, which is in bundle 6, document 40, page 1195. And the reason I asked you to look at that is, one, because I figured that it might assist for you to read it, but also because I was hoping to see whether there was anything you could say about these numbers that are mentioned briefly at the top of that page.
Yes.
In the document. And the section on Stenotrophomonas begins on page 22 of the report, which will be page 1217. Oh, I can count. That's excellent news.
Yes.
And clearly this is not your report. And the professor's been given evidence, and he's talked about this report to some extent. If we can look at the next page, and we zoom out to get the whole flavour of it, without looking at the detail of what's going on here, what is this figure? What form is this figure in terms of a scientific tool?
Okay, so it says the first three words: maximum likelihood tree. A dendrogram is a different word, and essentially, it's looking at the relatedness, the degree of relatedness of isolates, in this case from humans and from various environmental, predominantly water samples. And if the samples were all related, then there'd be a line on the right next to the text, and only one vertical line saying that they're all closely related. And as you move further away from right to left, as you have little connected groups that are then less or more connected, so you move from right to left. And essentially you can see that there are some relatedness of samples that were taken.
But before we leave that, because we don't want to get confused here.
Okay.
In a sense, if you were to flip this through 90 degrees, is it really just a family tree?
Yes, essentially it is. Yes,
The
it's a
higher
form
up
of
you
family
go,
tree. Yes.
the more generations, that's not quite the right word, the less connectedness there is of the joining point.
Yeah, the greater the number of differences in the genetic code between the organisms. Yeah.
Right, so it's not measuring generations, but it's measuring connectedness.
Yes, according to the number of differences that you can literally count 1, 2, 3, 4, up to hundreds or thousands or even more between in the genetic code between these Stenotrophomonas isolates.
Now, I interrupted you with saying there were some points where there are some connections.
Yeah, so you can
We can zoom in halfway at this point. It might help.
Yeah, so we can see. So if we look right in the middle of the SMG 201656.
So let's just slow down so we can find this.
Yeah, if you keep going down, it's also in the middle, just slightly below halfway.
16, so
SMG 20.
Let's go by the colours. So you see where there's a orange, yellow, purple, yellow.
So in between, there's several colours, and you get human RHC is yellow.
Yes.
If you go down to the next colour, which is there's a big group in the middle of non-coloured isolates.
Yes.
And just below halfway, you can see. Look at the code on the left.
SMG 201656
Yes.
N basement tank children's filter 2. That one.
And yes, and the one immediately below that, 1636. Look how closely they are related. You see that just gives you a little example, small example of the relatively. Without knowing the scale, I couldn't tell you how many differences, they're called SNP differences, doesn't matter in the genetic code, but you can see from that figure they are relatively closely related. But as you then say, well, how close those are, accepting those two are relatively closely related to each other, those environmental isolates, how related are those to other basement tank isolates? The answer, not very. And how closely are they related to human isolates? Not very at all. And that's how one interprets broadly the whole figure, the whole dendrogram here, the family tree.
So the more you have to go to the left to find the joining point, the less closely related.
Yes,
right.
Essentially. And the number of lines and connection points you have to go through, twigs and branches, the more of those, the less related they are. So you go moving further and further to the leaf at one end of a twig, and is that leaf related to another leaf on the other side of the tree, on another branch and another twig?
Now, in your report, the Case Notes Review Overview report, at the top of page 1071, don't leave this page, please. You described how there were 84 Stenotrophomonas. Well, let's go look at it. We will go to 1071. So we go back to 1071. What I want to do is look at that first paragraph.
Yes.
And if you could just tell us what's the important facts we need to pull out from that, so we go and compare it to the figure we were just looking at.
Okay, so 84 in total.
So that's the number of Stenotrophomonas infections?
No, just these are isolates or strains. Right. For the sake of, that they're essentially the same term here, isolate and strain. 84 different Stenotrophomonas strains, isolates, obtained from a variety of sources. Some patients were not told in detail which ones, and some from different environmental sources.
Now that number, where does that come from?
84?
Yes.
I don't know. It does refer in, I think, in the text to the appendix to this report. It says Appendix 1. At the end of the very first sentence of the Stenotrophomonas section on page 22, the prior page, to the dendrogram, that is, it says a total of 84 isolates identified by the diagnostic laboratory as Stenotrophomonas multifilia were sequenced, brackets, Appendix 1. I haven't seen Appendix 1.
So just to recap, because I got a little bit confused there. The 84 on page 1071 in your report, we're looking at on the screen.
Yes.
Is that the same 84 you think as figure
yes.
15?
To the best of my knowledge, it is, because I can remember seeing what appears to be the same diagram, and then some of the numbers match.
Okay. So what is the point that you're making in this first paragraph on page 1071?
Okay, so we know from our review that there were 23 Stenotrophomonas multifilia bloodstream infections in children. Only 15 of those were included in this analysis.
see.
It doesn't tell me that in this report, but I know that from the information we were given by Professor Leonard.
I see. And that's why you've said 15 up here at page 1071.
Yes.
Right.
If one looks in this dendrogram,
So we go back to page 1217, 1218. Next page.
the next page.
And zoom out, please.
So if you count the ones that are highlighted here, I counted 25. But some of those isolates, there's no dates on here. I don't know whether that's to help preserve patient anonymity, but obviously I've no idea which human RAH isolate this is referring to. I don't know whether it's the top one. I don't know whether it's from blood or somewhere else. Whether that information is in Appendix 1, I don't know. But there are 25 that are highlighted. But as I say, I know from the information that went into writing our report that only 15 of the 25 were from our cohort. In other words, 8 of the total of 23 isolates were missing.
So your position is that of the 25 isolates that were analysed,
Yes.
a third are not within your cohort. So they could be other children, adults, or other hospitals.
Yes, I mean, one of them, it's the 3, 4, 5, 6. The 7th one down that is highlighted, it's purple, dark purple.
Yes, ACHVIC.
I don't know what that is, but I don't recognise any of those abbreviations in relation to our case review.
Right.
The others largely I do. It's at the top one, human RAH. I don't know what that is.
Yes, because we know that RHC is the Children's Hospital and
Correct.
QEUH is
Yes.
the Adult Hospital.
Yes.
So that's your first point, is that a third of yours are effectively missing.
Yes.
Okay, we go back to 1071. Is there any particular other issues you have with that, the analysis that's currently summarised in Figure 15 in Professor Leonard's report?
Yes. So it's not detailed as much. I could give more detail, but it's actually quite simple detail. But I think it is pertinent if we could go back.
Firstly, before we look at it, why is it not detailed in the overview report?
That's a good question, because I don't remember whether I had as detailed a copy of this figure on which to do the analysis. I cannot recall. It's 3 years ago when I was reviewing the data available to write this text. And what I was trying to do in the report was just to give some exemplars as to why one could make some inference but not other inferences robustly without going into chapter and verse, and actually this was beyond our remit at one level, but at another level not. So that's why I can give you more detail now, which I think is relevant.
Well, let's go back to 1218 again.
Yeah.
So what was your other concerns that you now see in detail here?
Okay, so it's well known that drains in hospitals could be the source of contamination and indeed infection in patients. And it's gram negatives because they live in water essentially. And there are a total, out of these 84, there are 11 isolates that were obtained from samples taken from wards at ward level, not tanks in roofs or basements, at ward level, close to patients, 11. 8 of those 11 were from the relevant wards.
So that's Ward 6A and Ward 2A?
Yeah. The peak of the Stenotrophomonas infections, it was a very high peak, was in 2018. There were 12 infections in 2018, none or one in some of the other years, 4 or 5 in the other years, but a very clear peak in 2018. Of those drain isolates that I just referred to, none of them came from 2018. So we only have 8 from the relevant wards, none of which are from 2018, which is the peak of the Cenotrophomonas infections in children. If I just go one small step further, again, 2018, how many samples at ward level, now any water samples, not just drains, came from the cohort wards in 2018? The answer is 2.
And where are they on the table?
So, can you see, if you come up from the bottom, count 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 purples. 1, 2, 3, 4 purples. Go up to there, where the hand is, and look immediately below where the hand is. 1641 and 1615.
That's 2 showers taken on what must be the 5th of March.
Correct. From Ward 2A, from the shower mixers, it says, or shower mixed, whatever that means. You can see there, yes, as you say, both on the same day in March in 2018. That is the total number of isolates included in this analysis from water sources on the wards in 2018, when there were 12 infections throughout that year, and some of those were very clustered in time within the year. And that's why I conclude that it's just not possible to exclude water on, in this case, one of the cohort wards being related, or water sources being related to any of the 12 bloodstream infections that occurred in that year.
Just before we leave that, if we remember, you took us to a row with a purple human, Queen Elizabeth University Hospital.
Yes.
And then if we go 2 rows up, we have sample SMG 1676, environment Ward 2A. That's a Ward 2A sample, isn't it? It's a trough sink, whatever a TR room is, but it's a date on the 9th of September, so that's about just after DCAT.
Oh, the 5th of September.
Yes, sorry, the 5th of September.
Yes, I apologise. You're right, that's a trough sink, and I'd missed that one.
Yes.
That's the 3rd one.
But you're sure there's no other 2018 2As?
To the best of my knowledge, I looked through this several times today to give those numbers, but whether it's 2, as I said, and it's actually 3 ward samples in total from 2018 on a target ward, it's a very small number.
Now, if we go back to page 1071, your next paragraph dealt with Cuprividis. Cuprividis, I always get it wrong.
Yeah, Cuprividis, yeah.
Cuprividis. You seemed to suggest earlier on that you had a greater level of confidence in this piece of work involving Cuprividis. Or would I misunderstand?
Well, so there's this information here, but there's also IMT information, which is referred to elsewhere in our report, that inferred that the same strain was obtained from a water source, and I think it was it from an anaesthetic room where the patient had been briefly. I forget the detail. And the patient went on, the child went on to get a bloodstream infection. As I said a few minutes ago, there is a peer-reviewed scientific report from GGC authors about the Cuprividis relationship between water sources and
This is the aseptic pharmacy unit that we see.
yeah, yes. So
And there's another one, in fact, published in the Journal of Hospital Medicine about Mycobacterium cheloni as well.
yes, I think there is.
Yeah.
Yes. So there is the numbers are much smaller. That have been included in any whole genome sequence analysis. So as you can see here, a total of 263 isolates of Cupria viridis from water or surface sampling, and yet only 18 made it to the whole genome sequencing analysis.
So your point is that, firstly, not all the samples are being, retained samples are being, taken samples are being analysed.
Yes.
And secondly, that some of the samples don't seem to have a connection in place and time to the suspected instance.
Yes, there is a potential cogent reason why you would include some isolates from elsewhere or close but not exactly where you want to look, and that's to look in general and get a feel for whether there's any other links or just how far apart Cenotrophomonas, or in this case Cupria viridis strains, are to one another on a genetic basis. So it's not a criticism that one might look at isolates from here and there and so on, but the number from the key place and time, place being the wards, time, so we were discussing earlier, in particular 2018, the limitations there are stark.
So there is a point I suppose I have to put back to you, is that if we go back to page 12, 18, yeah, and take it the whole page, whilst it may well be, as you say, that the number of samples from September 2018 are low, the number of samples from the actual wards in issue are low, does this sort of exercise have any value in answering the question whether there is a single strain infecting the whole water system, or is that the wrong question?
I wouldn't say it's the wrong question, but I'd say it does answer that there isn't a single strain. It doesn't appear to be a single strain because where is it, despite all these different water sources? The premise that there is a single strain responsible for all the infections and all the contamination of a water system is naive. What one would expect to find is because biofilms are what contaminate water systems. Biofilms are effectively collections of organisms of different species, sometimes the same species, but different versions within those biofilms. So it's far, far, far more likely that if a water system was colonized, contaminated, and if that contamination went on to cause infections, that you would see a range of different organisms causing those infections.
Right, if we take that off the screen.
Right. Just to follow that, when you say a range of different organisms, do we mean different genera, different species, or are we down in the fine detail of strains?
Both, my lord.
Sorry?
So both, my lord. So I mean a range of different genera, and within species different, within one species, Stenotrophomonas multifilia, for example, a range of different Stenotrophus multifilias. These are organisms which have many relatives,
Right.
both within the species and then across species genera.
Okay.
And if we just, for completeness, we go to the bottom of page 1070 in the bundle 6, where you dealt with Enterobacter. Let's just understand what you're saying here in this final paragraph. What's the point, that the fundamental point to be made in this paragraph?
Okay, well, I mean, this is an analysis of a grand total of 42 isolates, only 6 of which come from the environment. 6. I've already mentioned that there are 2 IMTs that I referred to in our report, one in 2018 and one in 2019, that implicate. One of those actually said the water was the source, the drains. This was an Enterobacter cluster. And yet we've got a grand total here of 6 environmental isolates. So with such a small number, it would be either incredibly good or bad, from one's perspective, luck to match one of 6 environmental isolates with any one of 36 patient isolates. It's the needle in a haystack analogy is very pertinent here. You're just not going to find a match. And therefore, the fact that you don't find a match does not exclude a working hypothesis of contamination from the water causing infections in patients.
The next sentence, however, isolates from 5 of the children with Enterobacter were not included. How many infections involving Enterobacter were in your cohort?
I
don't know whether you want to look at 10, 30 if you can't remember.
If you could go to 10, 30. Well, I know it's table 4.2 on page 54 of our report. That's where the table is that tells us.
In that case, it's on page 1028.
Yes, if you could scan. Yeah. So where are we? Enterobacter is
table
there.
4.2.
27. It says in the right-hand column there were 27 in total.
So just under a fifth.
Yes, that's organisms. The 5 is patients. So if a patient had more than one isolate, that they could be on. It could be more than a fifth, if you see what I mean.
But one of the things that I certainly found it conceptually hard to understand, and maybe I'm just being foolish, but I'll put it to you, is there seem to be 2 points that are being made by those who promote this analysis. The first is that you can look at environmental samples and patient samples and notice that there is not a close relationship between the patient samples and the environmental samples. And I can well understand, as we just discussed, that where the patient samples are from, when they are from, and how many they are might be relevant to that. And I can conceptually understand that. So I'm going to park that and move to the next option.
Yes.
If you have 27 isolates and you have samples for 22, and looking at the bottom of page 1028, they're scattered sort of evenly over 3 years. Why is it not right to look at those, the ones you have samples for, and say, well, are they related? Because surely if there was an environmental source of Enterobacter in the water system, then all the patients would have the same or similar Enterobacters in their isolates. Why is that wrong?
Well, rather like the answer I gave to my lord, the one would, if one knew nothing else about the cases, but the Enterobacter were involved in 27 Enterobacters were involved in these bloodstream infections, I would not expect one Enterobacter to be responsible across 5 years. I would expect multiple, absolutely expect multiple, and which one or ones were involved at any one point in time. One could be involved, disappear in inverted commas, still be in a biofilm, reappear or not. But one would expect in a contaminated water system, and virtually all plug holes, by the way, get contaminated. You would expect many different types over time of, in this case, Enterobacter.
Why would you expect that? What's the evidential basis for that?
Because if one looks in the scientific literature of when people have sequentially sampled water or drain samples, swabs down drains, or take the U-bend off, take samples out, you will find a variety of different organisms across different genera. You will find a variety of different organisms within individual species. It's a zoo. It's a microbiological zoo in the water.
Right. What I want to do now is to pick up a few other issues that have been raised about this whole genome sequencing thing. And so Dr. Crichton, who's now the Director of Public Health, and who wrote the commentary on epidemiology that's in the public health commentary that you saw, she gave evidence, and just for my colleagues' benefit, it's in her statement at paragraph 199, that she took the view that whilst a lack of typing doesn't rule out a connection, it does make it less likely. So what would you say to those who say, well, okay, it's not this data isn't a way, these conclusions aren't a way of excluding a connection, but what we see in Professor Leonard's work that you saw then and you saw now should at least be a factor to suggest there's less likelihood of a connection. It's a sort of pressure on the scales, as it were.
Yes. Well, it would be perverse to try and claim that the data had no value in refuting that hypothesis, partially refuting. But my point is that such are the limitations of the data, the missing data, the limits in the number of samples from key likely areas of contamination. Such are those limitations that it's a very limited refute of that hypothesis. So better than nothing, but still in no way goes a long way to excluding the environment as a source.
One of the issues that came up in evidence over the inquiry is that one of the issues that must arise is the taking of the sample, whether it's a patient isolate or an environmental isolate. At some point, you've got to pick the colony off the plate that you've grown, yes, and decide what to analyze. We've had some debate to the extent we've gone back to certain witnesses with a questionnaire, which we'll put out to core participants next week, as to what's the right answer to this question. The question being, how many colonies do you need to pick off a sampling, an agar plate you've grown the sample on, before you can be sure that you fully understand the diversity of the population of the strain in the sample? Okay,
so just the preamble to answering the question is that this is one sample on one time point on one day.
Yes.
And then we're growing 24, 48, 72 hours down the line from that sample something. And let's just assume, to make it easier, that the something is the same species, is Enterobacter cloacae, and manifest as a number of colonies growing on a plate. It could be one colony, it could be too many colonies to count. It could literally be hundreds, yes, on a plate. Taking one colony is certainly not sufficient to say I've got a representative sample of all these, let's say, 100 colonies that are growing. The more colonies that are growing, the greater the number of colonies one would, in reality, need to pick off to have that degree of confidence. In practice, in scientific practice, when one's trying to convince one's peers here, I would expect to see at least a double-digit number of colonies picked off on a plate. There isn't an absolute, if I try to claim the magic number is 14 or 36, that would be wrong. But it isn't 1, it isn't 2, it isn't 3. And the more colonies that are growing, the greater the number. And you can't just just take a sweep across all the colonies, because if you do that, your genetic information will be a jumble. You'll have jumbled up potentially several different organisms into one genetic code.
Right. You said that you were doing it when trying to convince your peers. If you're analysing a sample from the environment as part of your monitoring, or reactively, or you're indeed analysing a sample from a patient in order to treat them, is there a different requirement for the number of colonies one would pick if your purpose is either monitoring or patient treating?
Well, if this was a clinical sample.
Yes, for clinical sample, how do you define that?
So by and large, one would know, if it was a blood sample, for example, the great majority of the time, if there are bugs in the blood, it's one bug, one type of bug.
Right.
That we just know that. Occasionally you might find 2 or 3 different ones. Yeah. That's usually in very, very sick people. And it may be a pre-death phenomenon, actually. Not always, but maybe. When it moves to environmental samples, because of the zoo.
So just before we leave that, in that situation, you can just pick one.
Yes, that would be accepted practice to pick one. And in fact, yes, that's exactly what one would do normally. If we move to environmental samples, because of the zoo analogy that I used, then by inference, one would need to. It depends on the exam question. If the exam question in that scenario is the water contaminated, you might just have set a threshold and you want to know, are there more than 100 bugs in this 100 ml sample that I've spun down and put on the plate? Mm-hmm. Counted, yes, more than 100, it's contaminated. If the next level of exam question is, but is there any Pseudomonas there? Then you obviously got to go further extremes to look at the different colonies growing, and you might have to use different agar plates.
Well, and did we have some evidence from Dr. Redding about that?
Yes, to look for just Pseudomonas or just Cupria viridis.
And to some extent, is what you're looking for is not quite what you find, but you only find what you're looking for.
Absolutely. And a lot of the samples that we had access to the results of the environmental samples, the water samples, a lot of them, I can't remember the numbers, so I do give some examples in the report, we give some examples, they'd only looked for one bug. So they were particularly concerned at one time about Cupria viridis, so the samples had just been examined, it would appear, for one bug and one bug only. So if that bug's not there, there could have been bug Y, but they only looked for bug X.
What I want to do now is to look back at Stenotrophomonas, because I should have done it 5 minutes ago and I missed out. If we go to page 1045, we looked again. You see that the striking excess of Stenotrophomonas, which is actually, if we go to the previous page, we see table 5.4.
Yeah.
And you have 14 Stenotrophomonas in your most likely category.
Yeah.
We've heard from Evans what most likely means. But you then go on to the next page, top of page 1045, there is a striking excess of Stenotrophomonas SVP in the most likely group, which is significant, chi-squared test 14.8. I can never remember what the P means, but anyway. The point is, what do you say to the challenge there that because of the work by Professor Leonard, there's no connection between these cases, the human samples, and therefore the statistical significance is perhaps chance?
Well, remember we talked earlier about the being the very marked peak of Stenotrophomonas bloodstream infections in 2018, 12. In 2015, the first year, there were none, and I think there was either none or one the next year, and it was 3, 4, 5 approximately the next year, 2017, and then 2018, 12. And you just have to look at those numbers in time and place, and either it's one large coincidence that a relatively uncommon organism in the blood, you saw 12 examples of them in one 12-month period, and actually it was even more clustered than that. There was a lot of those 12 were clustered into 1 or 2 few weeks or few months. I forget the detail. That is a red flag for an event or series of events causing 12 times the number in 1 year than in some other years, 12 versus 1. So then remember that one of the criteria for determining how likely we judged a bloodstream infection to be related to the environment, one of the criteria was clustering in time and place.
Yes.
And of course, with Stenotrophomonas, I've just described clustering in time and place. There were other clusters in other years, but there was an absolutely clear cluster or more than one cluster in 2018. So one actually drives the other here, that we would therefore, it's no great surprise given that very large increase, 12 in 2018 from none or one in other years, that those infections by this organism are overrepresented in the most likely group. Hence this significant excess in the most likely group.
And the challenge about whole genome sequencing is answered by the evidence you've already given about the quality of that work. Right. Clustering is an area which has, I think, received some criticism from the Health Board in their comments about your draft, I seem to remember. And what I want to do is, how do you respond to the suggestion that, to some extent, your work is effectively just seeing clusters and finding a likelihood of probable of environmental connection when you see a cluster?
There has to be an explanation for the extremely marked clustering that we saw in some examples. That's the first thing I would say, and I won't repeat the Stenotrophomonas data, but there were other clear clusters in time and place of Enterobacter. As you get fewer and fewer infections caused by Cupria viridis or Morganella or whatever, then it's harder to see the clustering. But so the clustering is either just very bad luck, or there's an explanation or series of explanations. If you then, when you look at the individuals, find they're very unlikely just to have come into hospital, they've been in hospital for some time, they don't apparently have clear evidence of gut inflammation. Typhlitis is one of the terms used to describe that makes their gut wall leaky, in other words, more prone to endogenous bloodstream infection. If those are not present, we're building up evidence against the environment as a potential source here. So does this represent absolute proof that the environment is involved? Of course it does not. But I can't stress enough that routine infection control analysis on a day-to-day basis in hospitals or GP practices for that matter is based on time, place, person, and it's an absolute golden rule about how one initially sets a hypothesis and then looks to refute that hypothesis. And there are just too many, I would argue here, too many pointers for particular clusters, Stenotrophomonas, Enterobacter being the prime examples, to refute with any confidence a relationship with environmental contamination.
Thank you. To what? I mean, obviously there were criticisms in their commentary paper that the Health Board, they saw the draft and they commented on the report, and you made certain changes and you provided us with your workings, and we can read that. But to what extent? How do you respond to this suggestion? The Health Board received your overview paper in draft. They didn't receive the individual analyses because of the confidentiality constraint you just described at the beginning of your evidence. They can only be given to the Health Board if the families agreed. So it's perhaps not really, is it not really surprising the Health Board were surprised and discombobulated because they can't see your working?
I can understand a sense of perhaps frustration that they didn't have access to all the material. But we'd spent 18 months, admittedly during a pandemic, but 18 months nevertheless doing this analysis, and we had to do this analysis and this review 3 times because of the lag in obtaining some of the data which we'd asked for. So it was an extremely thorough analysis, a redo, and then a redo. Their own IMTs, at least 2, there were potentially others, but at least 2, they're highlighted in our report, concluded that water contamination, and I'm using that term in its most general sense, it may include drains, were believed to be responsible for the infections. So I don't think one could, having concluded that internally in an incident management team, the highest level of review about a potential safety issue, if they concluded that, I don't think it could be a great surprise that the environment was potentially being implicated here. And I go on to say the trust themselves, GGC, went on to move the patients from 2 wards, treat the whole of the water system, try and decontaminate drains as well as bringing in expertise and so on. You don't do that on a whim if you don't strongly suspect, an environmental etiology.
Because one of the points that I think will be made in response is that those steps, the point of use filters, the decants, the chlorine dioxide, the increased water testing, were being made by the health board as examples of effectively the precautionary principle, and they shouldn't be seen as determinative. They've accepted there's a link to the environment at what one witness I think described last week as the corporate level of the board. How do you respond to that?
I think there are other things one could have done if one was only mildly suspicious, if I could put it that way, that the environment was involved here. One could have set up, for example, a systematic sampling system which would have looked in far more detail, not just once every few months in any one particular point on a ward, but would have looked daily or weekly for a period of time, intensively examined those samples to give one the confidence that the drain samples or the water samples or the tank samples, whatever, were not contaminated. That did not happen, and we are critical in our report about the non-systematic way in which the environment was sampled. So one could have done that. That didn't happen. One could have brought in experts. I don't know to some extent how much this was done, but you could have brought in experts to say, you're okay, we don't think it's the water system involved. And others I could cite as well, but no, that's not what happened, and we actually...
So just on that bit, bringing experts, would you have had access to the work of the water technical group and the reports that were done by Dr. Mackin and Mr. Wafer and others, Suzanne Lee, in 2018 around the time of what was called the water incident, or would you not have seen those?
I don't recall. I can't. That's not an absolute, but I don't recall. I know one of the names quite well. One of the experts, Tom Mackin, and I think I would have remembered because I know that person. I've worked with him previously.
So one of the things that, just while we're talking about sampling and systemic, it's yes, you're right that in the time up in 2019 there isn't a systemic sampling program. There might have been one later, but What's wrong with simply going and finding all your historical samples and analysing them, which is effectively what they've done to try and understand things? What's wrong with that approach?
Because it's piecemeal by its very nature. So it's not wrong to have done it, but one must recognise the limitations of what one has done. That's all I'm saying, essentially. One has missed a certain number of key patient samples. One has a very limited number of potential key water source samples. You put the two emissions together, and there's a big hole in one's level of confidence in any resulting analysis.
What I'd like to do is look at your statement and something to do with this systemic sampling issue, which is page 86 of the statement bundle, paragraph 41. So paragraph 41 starts off dealing with whole genome sequencing, but the bottom half of the paragraph begins, there was no systemic use of typing either in real time or after the event. Of even greater concern, and this is detailed in the report, the sampling of potential environmental warts was not systemic. He just said effectively just that. What I wanted to put to you is, in addition to not knowing about what Tim Mackin was up to and the others, would you have had any knowledge about the amount of resource being made available to the Estates Department to do this work at the time?
No.
No. Would you know anything about the staffing levels that in the Estates Department when the hospital opened?
No.
No. A question that I asked of Ms. Evans was about the DMA Canyon risk assessment reports, about the Water Legionella risk assessment reports from 2015, 2017. Did you see those?
I can't recall.
Well, I'm just going to show you the front page because it might
Okay.
it might speed things up if we can find it.
Thank you.
So if we go to page 122 of bundle 6, it's quite a striking image. Have you seen this before?
I don't think so, because the front cover is quite
It's quite a dramatic format.
memorable.
Yes,
so
and they all look the same. They have the same style, so I won't. That's fine.
Yep.
Would you have received information about where the responsibility lay for deciding the watering test levels between the lead ICD, the water safety group, the head of estates? You would not have known any of that.
No.
And one piece of evidence I asked Ms. Evans about, she said you might be the person to answer, so we'll see how this goes, is we've had evidence from Dr. Inkster that for the period she was lead ICD from 16 to 19, she had 10 sessions. 5 of them were as lead ICD for the whole health board, and 5 of them were in microbiology. We've also had evidence there would have been sector ICDs, and this hospital is effectively one sector, with a couple of ICD sessions and the rest microbiology. And in addition, there would have been not only a director level nursing, associate nursing director at the top, but lead nurses in each of the hospitals. And this hospital would have had 2. So it would have had one for the children's, one for the adult, and then there would have been teams of nurses under their supervision.
Yes.
In terms of the ICD level of staffing, I mean, you've been on ICD, I take it.
I've been an ICD, I've been a DIPSI, Director of Infection Prevention and Control as well.
So in terms of a hospital this size, is 5 sessions of ICD across the whole health board area and 2 sessions or thereabouts, 2 or 3, for the sector ICD, enough ICD, as it were?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Probably the sensible way to answer, well, I can give you 2 answers. 1, no, but 2, it's not beyond what one would still see to this day in large hospitals. And I could draw an analogy with some I know very well.
So, for example, Leeds, which incidentally the Children's Hospital is one of our comparators in our epidemiology work, so it might be quite handy. You wouldn't happen to know how many ICD sessions are in that hospital? If you don't know,
it's approximately the same order of magnitude. It's certainly not 10, but it's so 10 is a whole time equivalent. So 10 PAs, 4 hours each PA, 10 4s are 40 per week hours. So I couldn't nail to the mast, but I would be surprised if it's more than 5 or 6. When I was it was 4.
Right. So it's getting better, but slowly.
Yes, and I think that's a trend, but it's not a mind shift to having two individuals whole-time equivalent just dealing with ICD issues, for example.
Now, I continue to go back to bits of standard trophic moments I should have dealt with before. We can go back to the statement bundle, page 87, paragraph 44. You say in the middle of this paragraph, do you see on the left-hand edge the word isolates appears about halfway down? Paragraph 44?
Yes.
And then a bit further on, after the second Stenotrophomonas, the sentence, there could be 20 different Stenotrophomonas species in the water, of which only 3 ever get into patients. It's so complex. Are those numbers just, as it were, grabbed for example, or are they?
Yes, they're numbers to illustrate the zoo phenomenon that
Right.
I was referring to earlier.
You make a criticism on paragraph 46 on page 88 of the absence of, as it were, before and after systemic sampling around the time fitting the chlorine dioxide system. You see that paragraph?
Yes,
Yes.
I
Now,
can see it.
what difference do you think that would have made if it had happened to the utility of whole genome sequencing data to you a year later, if you'd still been around, as it were?
Well, can I answer the relevance of the whole genome sequencing data sort of
By all means.
second to what I'll say is that you've got a point in time intervention, the chlorination. It's a prime opportunity to look before and after at the effects of that intervention. And if you can show you go from made up numbers 1,000 to 1 levels of bugs in water, then you can say, look what we've achieved. If you don't take that opportunity, you just simply do not know. And it may be that the chlorination has killed free-floating bacteria that have been liberated from the biofilms, but actually the biofilms themselves are still okay. They're still harbouring lots of organisms. So the relevance of that missed opportunity, if one didn't do that intensive sampling before and after, is that, well, particularly if there are emissions in one's whole genome sequencing analysis, which we've discussed, then, had you at least been able to say, well, look, we've gone from 1,000 to 1 after, we've carried out this whole genome sequence analysis, we've taken all the ones we could find after, still infections going on in children, but none of these ones, there's virtually nothing there, but we've analysed everything that moves and there's no link. They didn't analyse everything that moved. There wasn't a systematic sampling process in place. There was a look for this, but not for that variable with time and with sample, and this missed opportunity for vigorous sampling before and after acute intervention.
That's really helpful. What I want to do is move on to the possibly strange topic of comparative epidemiology. Now, I'm conscious that, did you ever see the protocol that set out the nature of the work of the case notes review? Because I don't think Miss Evans did see it. We'll stick it on the screen. It's the separate PDF to my colleague at the back.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but if you could
Well, we'll just see what it is.
Yeah.
So this was in bundle, it's supposed to be in bundle 24, volume 6. Bundle 27, volume 6, document 24. That's it, yes. This was produced, we're told, in February 2020 and is the case notes review epidemiological protocol.
Yeah, I do believe I have seen this.
Yes. Well, I'm not going to take you through it because that would, I think, be unfair if you haven't seen it for years.
Yeah.
Just to ask you this question is, a criticism is made of the work of the case notes review by the medical director, Dr. Armstrong, and that's in the transcript, column 212, that it's a weakness of your approach that the work was done without looking at a comparator hospital. And to what extent, well, why didn't you do a comparison piece of work as well alongside the analysis of the actual individual cases?
Okay. So, as I understand it, our brief started with a minister standing up in the Scottish Parliament and saying there's going to be a case note review. as I understand it, that's what
Yes.
happened, and that's what we carried out. However, we did go further than simply reviewing each case and nothing else,
Yeah.
as we've discussed today. And we went quite a bit further. But there are, so first of all, why did we not compare GGC with St. Elsewhere? Well, first of all, if you were going to do that, where am I going to get the data from? I had no access to the data. We had no access to the data from St. Elsewhere, A, B, C, D, and so on. And simply comparing the data with just St. Elsewhere A would not be a robust.
So you've got to compare it with multiple hospitals.
Yeah, it has to be multiple hospitals with as close as you could achieve similar case mix, which is difficult, very difficult, because GGC is a regional, in fact, national referral centre for sick children with rare tumours, particularly leukemias, who needed stem cell transplants, SCTs. So there isn't another Glasgow, as I understand it, in Scotland. So you'd probably be having to go to other paediatric specialist hospitals in south of the border. Okay, that would be possible, but we had no access to do that. And even if one had done that, the finding another unit that had an identical, well, you're never going to find an identical case mix, but a similar case mix. That's a tall order. The interventions that happen in Glasgow, whether they use antibiotic prophylaxis, which we talk about briefly in our report, or not, whether they pre-treat individuals with radiotherapy or not, how they carry out their stem cell transplants. There's so many variables. And if you are going to do that and try and compare with St. Elsewhere A, B, C, D, and so on, assuming you could find A, B, C, and D, the scientifically robust way of doing that is by using a propensity matching exercise, where you look for all the risk factors that are in your cohort of 84 children, I think it was 84, versus the, let's say, 84, for sake of better, that are in St. Elsewhere A, and 84 or thereabouts that are in St. Elsewhere B. And you try and adjust the data to take account of the risk factors for infection. But that's it, that you can only adjust the data for the risk factors you know about. So I'm trying to simplify what is a very complicated process. And can I just add one other element to illustrate how difficult this is? We mention it in our report, how in GGC there'd been a real campaign to drive down catheter related bloodstream infections. Bloodstream.
This is the CLABSI work.
Exactly, the central line associated bloodstream infections, CLABSI, exactly. Most of which you'd expect to be caused by gram-positive organisms. So you would expect, on the back of a successful campaign, and there was apparently some success there, to drive down your CLABSI bloodstream-related bloodstream infections, which would be caused by gram-positive organisms. So your overall rate of infection might go down. But if at the same time you've got an excess of gram-negative infections, your rate comes back up to the same as it was had you not been successful in one part of the story. So you compare your rate with St. Elsewhere A or B or C, and you find, oh, our rate is comparable. That doesn't tell you you haven't got an excess in one place and not the other.
Is there any value in doing this? You decide you're only going to deal with gram-negatives. You are going to compare with more than one centre. You're going to pick tertiary hemato-oncology wards. You're not going to worry about any of the detail that you've just discussed between them. And you're just going to get as much information as you can for a handful of wards across England and Wales. And if you did that, what would you need to find in terms of a signal for you to be confident that it wasn't, as it were, just lost in the differences?
So you'd have to look both qualitatively and quantitatively at the numbers. So, and what I mean by that is you would, yes, work out the rate in GGC, work out the rate of bloodstream infections, just the gram negs in St. Elsewhere A and B and C. But within those rates of now, your analogy, just gram-negative bloodstream infections, you would need to look, yes, but which gram-negative bloodstream infections?
Yes.
Because some of those risk factors I talked about, whether they're using antibiotic prophylaxis in one centre but not the other, could drive down some gram-negs but have no effect on the others. They could even encourage others. And so you'd have to look amongst the gram-negative bloodstream infections with an apparently similar rate to see if Stenotrophomonas or Enterobacter were overrepresented in one centre versus another.
Okay. And this is why you didn't do this?
Well, we didn't do it because it wasn't our brief. We had no access to the data to allow us to do it. This was had we had a light bulb moment and said, we absolutely need to do this, there was a pandemic going on, it would have been virtually almost impossible to do it, but it was way beyond our brief, and we were not, it seemed so far beyond our brief that it was not integral to being able to draw conclusions that we drew.
Thank you. What I want to do is pick up a few discrete topics and then see if there are any other questions in the room, because we're nearly at the end. One of the things that Professor Leonard raised in his evidence on the 9th of October was an observation that explained he reached that meropenem might have been, meropenem use earlier in the cohort of patients might have later on in 2019 and 2018 caused an increase in some of the infections that they were seeing. So in the sense that the change to the population of the microorganisms in the patients was to some extent driven by antimicrobial resistant microorganisms reacting to meropenem. Now, I'm not showing you the graph that he looked at in a work by Ms. Harvey-Wood. We've asked her for a supplementary statement, and we'll do that. I'm just stay at a very high level of principle here. If something like that was going on in a unit, if there was a increase of organisms caused by antibiotic resistance, and it was a meropenem, how would you know? I mean, if you were in that ward, what sort of things will you be looking for to see that it had happened?
So is that plausible that antibiotics can select for microorganisms and then you get an excess of infections? Yes. But getting an excess of bloodstream infections, where the bugs have got to come from somewhere, either from within the gut usually, or without, that's quite a bit more tenuous. But the key thing that refutes that hypothesis is that you would not expect clustering in 2018 with Stenotrophomonas, then the clustering goes away or reduces significantly. You would not expect very clear clusters, 6, 7, 8 cases across a few weeks, 2 or 3 months, which then go away, because your selection pressure, if the hypothesis is correct, would surely still be there.
Right.
The antibiotic selection pressure. So I don't think that's tenable.
There's a related hypothesis that the infections that were seen were, to a greater extent than perhaps you and your colleagues have found, had their origin in the patient's own flora or infections brought in from outside by patients. If that was going on in a hemato-oncology pediatric ward, again, how would you know that that was going on? What would you see?
Well, if that was going on, you wouldn't expect the very clear clusters in time and place that I've just referred to. And if that did happen, if you could, it is feasible, you could get clustering in time and place. Let's say someone had brought in bug X from the outside, developed their own infection or not, given it to another patient via a healthcare worker or directly by playing with the other child, whatever. But when you typed those organisms, you'd expect to find very easily the same strain that's gone from A to B to C to D child.
Because you only get one strain per patient at one time most of the time.
In the blood.
In the blood,
yes. Yes. Whereas what we can see is more analogous with a zoo, with the organisms coming from a much more diverse population, not just one person bringing in her Stenotrophomonas, another child bringing in his Enterobacter species, which then runs around the unit.
Because in that case, everyone's going to have the same thing.
You'd find much less diversity, expect to find much less diversity.
Okay. That brings us into the, I think you actually answered that, so I shall cross that out. I want to look at something you've said in your statement at page 77, paragraph 18. And it relates to what we've just discussed. You say, I've been asked to explain how we reached the conclusion that there were no potential signals of an environmental source elsewhere. This was my assumption and was formulated from what we were told initially and the focus of bacteremia caused by gram-negative environmental bacteria. What sort of assumption is this? Is this an underlying assumption to your work, or because assumptions seem important?
Well, I think I said earlier, gram-negative bacteria like to live in warm, wet conditions. So, plug holes are ideal, pipes and moist parts of our body. So not on the dry, inhospitable skin, but inside our guts, warm and wet. So if one's looking for a source of an environmental source of gram-negative bacteria, one would naturally hypothesize that it would be water types of sources, as opposed to tabletops, floors, ceilings, and so on, or air conditioning systems. I then go on in the paragraph to mention, or it is mentioned, that Cryptococcus cases, which, if one just was asked to say 3 or 4 words that come into my mind as soon as I hear Cryptococcus, you'd think the air, pigeons, contaminated air systems, lack of positive pressure ventilation. None of those things are, say, waterborne or sources. Bugs can often have very often have very preferred habitats. The preferred habitat of a Cryptococcus is very different from the preferred habitat of the gram-negative bacteria.
What I'm concerned about is that I appreciate that if we ignore Cryptococcus and focus on gram-negatives,
yep,
that if your normal assumption is, and I don't think anyone's disagreeing this, that if they're not in, the gram-negatives want to live somewhere warm and wet, that'll be your gut, a drain, the water tank, a puddle, sort of thing. The way you phrased it does run the risk of looking like you've assumed there's an environmental source.
Yes,
is that what you've done?
No. Well, first of all, our hypothesis, our remit was to examine the cohort of cases and determine if we could deduce there was likely to be an environmental source. So that was our remit. So there is there is a risk there of an assumption in that remit. However, I would like to believe that most of my type, including Gaynor and Mike, my compatriots, are natural skeptics. And so we actually look for reasons to reject a hypothesis at least as much, if not more, than we look for reasons to accept it. It's just that I think I've explained why I think runs in weeks and months of the same bug occurring again and again and again,
Right.
and then it goes away. Doesn't sing endogenous infection, so it says exogenous. Where's it going to come from if it's not a water source? You could say, well, all the saline bags that had been produced just for Glasgow had been contaminated with different Stenotrophomonas multifilia isolates, and then they had this phenomenon. It just is not going to happen. So there's a very limited actual number of broad conclusions one could come to in this scenario with this degree of epidemiology and clustering.
What I want to do is turn to page 99 of your statement, paragraph 75, when you discuss your interactions with the whistleblowers. Now, I've discussed this in some detail with Ms. Evans, so I think I can probably take this relatively quickly with you, which is, in this section you're discussing, during our review, we engaged a number of key staff involved in IPC at NHS Greater Glasgow, who advised us they'd been denied access to water sampling and testing information despite multiple requests. This information was coming from whistleblowers with whom we met on more than one occasion. And I get that, and that's what they've told us. But clearly, we had to be careful about what we were told and what we said in those meetings, and I believe we were careful. Why did you have to be careful?
It was a two-way process. I think we had to be careful to listen to what we were being told, but to then ask questions either real time to the person's telling us that, or discuss separately the plausibility of what we were being told. I think clearly we were carrying out a case review with anonymized patient data. That fact alone means there was a need to be careful about, would we home into one particular patient who might have had a very severe outcome. So I think I've been involved more than once with a scenario of someone, let's say a whistleblower, or someone taking a different viewpoint, and one has to, I think, be very cautious in receiving and giving information in that context. That's what that means.
Would you have been given information by those who, I suppose, decidedly were not whistleblowers, who worked for the board, that explained the board position about this issue? Because I think that comes up in the letter from the chief executive on the 5th of March.
Yes, I can partly remember. I can't remember the exact wording. So pro tem during our review, I don't remember us being, someone proactively from the board, from GGC, saying, just need to make it clear that you may come across individuals A and B who are saying X, Y, Z. Our view is that there's an error here, or you need to understand the context. That didn't happen.
So when you have, when you have stuff in your draft report where you discuss there was an absence of this, we couldn't find such and such, the IMT didn't do that.
Yes.
That's all drawn from the documents you were looking at, not from interviews with senior people in the board.
It is, but we had to go back sometimes 3 or 4 times to ask for information.
But what I'm trying to say is you weren't being briefed, you were reading it yourself.
Correct. And obviously, ultimately, we produced our report and there was the opportunity for GGC to come back. And they did about some things, but it was a relatively limited list of things that they took issue to. Some of them might be bigger than others, but it wasn't on everything we'd said did they take issue. Could I just, to this day, it still sends a shiver down my spine, is the first, when I read the first sentence in this section, paragraph 75. I have never, ever come across a colleague telling me that they have been denied access to absolutely core information to enable them to do their job.
But that source is a person, not a document.
That, in this case, that was a person telling us that, yes.
Okay. Well, obviously, we've spoken to the people involved, so we'll make our own minds up, but that's very helpful.
Yeah, just saying that is a real standout moment in this process, and not the standout moment, but a standout moment.
If we just go back to paragraph 72, I think you've actually already answered this question, but I think it's probably worth just doing it. We talked about Mycobacterium chelonae, and I want to just show you what I think is the report that's published on this piece of work.
Okay.
And just see if you've read it, just join the dots. So it's actually in bundle 18, volume 1, document 52, at page 3550. I suspect you'll recognise it. Could this be, have you ever seen this paper before? I mean, I realise it's a bit of a cruel trick to
have I read it, first to last sentence? No, I haven't, but I have seen this, and I have read the abstract, which is admittedly an overview, but yes, I am aware.
So it's not by VNTR typing; it is whole genome sequencing typing.
Correct.
And your concern that you express about the validity of the connection, is that based on reviewing this paper first, or?
No, I wasn't aware of this until after this was published in 2021.
Yes.
I don't recall, I don't know when in 2021. I was somewhat otherwise occupied in 2021.
I appreciate that.
And so I probably saw this way after we submitted.
So just getting the chronology, the discussion in the overview report about this particular infection and its sequencing and its linkage, and the slight degree of skepticism that you express as a group about that predates the publication of this report.
To the best of my knowledge, I don't recall this ever being aware of this pre-report. Yeah,
that's very helpful. Right. And what I want to do is now just to take you back to the overview report itself, to bundle 6, page 984, and the second paragraph. Now, this is almost the very end of your executive summary. Now, do you see how you reported, we recognise that some families will disappoint in our ability to identify a link between their child's infection and the hospital environment with greater certainty than has been possible. It's the sentence that follows that I'm interested in, where you've gone, this not only represents the limits of a retrospective review and the shortcomings we have described in the data access, but also highlights the fundamental challenge of identifying a specific source in all such infections. Given that approaching it from a different end of the telescope, this inquiry has also been set the task of working out whether there is a connection between the hospital environment and risk to patients. To what extent is what you were doing or what we're doing actually possible to get an answer?
It's a very good question. Like us, you are unlikely to be able to get to absolute proof of an answer, and you'll have to, like us, weigh up the lines of evidence and make a conclusion. And now the level of certainty you, my lord, will have in making that conclusion, who knows? But it's a very similar process in lots of respects. You might use different terms, and you might take issue with most likely and very probable and so on. But on the grounds, I'm very used to the term on the grounds of probability. Freudian slip there. But we deal with possibility, probability, not necessarily in the strict legal context on a day-to-day basis in infection prevention and control.
If you're going to say this, I'll take you to your table because I think it's going to make life slightly easier.
Okay.
So if we go to of course, I've shot past it. I'll get back to it. Page 1043, table 5.3. So if we, do you want to continue? Because now you've got it in front of you.
Yeah. So it was an iterative. It would have been helpful, I think, if we'd said that. We allude to this. I don't think we say it as clearly as what I say next. It was an iterative process to try to ascribe level of certainty, the level of certainty, of course, not absolute certainty, the level of certainty around whether the environment was or was not involved per case. Early on in that iterative process, I think we were possibly over-ambitious in terms of weak possible, possible, strong possible, and so on. In retrospect, I think we were over-ambitious, but it was done with good intention, and it was to try and at least record real time in our process the relative degrees of certainty or uncertainty in our conclusion per case. In the report, and in our ultimate analysis, we then condensed some of those six groups. It's 5 actually, if you exclude unrelated and definites. So we then tried to coalesce them. Had we done that from the outset, I think we could have equally been criticised to say, well, hold on a minute, you're putting all these probables together, but you're putting all the possibles in one basket. What about the ones that were almost improbable? So I think by using this iterative process of describing and trying to measure the degree of certainty, I think that gave us confidence. And remember, as I say, we did these case reviews 3 times. So that gave us the opportunity, for better or for worse, to revisit whether this really was a strong possible, or in fact, when you look at this and you add that extra piece in the jigsaw, it's a probable. So I think it looks over-ambitious here. In the context of the whole investigation, it was probably a reasonable part of an iterative process.
And since I've got time, I'll ask you, where would you draw the line of more likely than not in that table?
Well, technically, it's 51% or more.
Yeah, so where is 51% or more?
But we do not do that in day-to-day infection prevention and control. What one looks at the evidence, one takes a consensus view. It's rarely one individual. You take a consensus view, you discuss, you go through the evidence as we did as a threesome, and you say, okay, do we think, and as far as we're concerned here, probable is 51 and above, and then strong probable was a number higher than 51. I'm not going to try and claim, well, it had to get to 75.2 because that'd be making it up. But probable meant we were concerned sufficiently that this was, on the grounds of probability, more likely than not 51% or more.
Thank you. I'm going to also take advantage of a little bit more time to ask you another question. So there was been some evidence about the mechanics of what happened in 2018 and 2019, the management of these events. And I don't think you will have necessarily seen this because you've not heard people who've just read the documents. But given that you've been a Director of Environmental Control and you're a professor in the field, I'll just take the opportunity of asking you. There was some evidence from Dr. Inkster that early in 2018, she had suggested that there would be some form, in addition to the IMT, there'd be some form of executive control group that would sit above the IMT. It would report to, as would the various groups dealing with the water systems and changes they were going to make. And then when the decant happened in September that year, we had evidence of a group of executive members ultimately making the decision to go ahead with the decant after some reflection. And then when there was a small decant in 2019 to this clinical decision unit, there's some evidence of a meeting where an IMT decision was then discussed with executive members. What I want to ask you is, in IPC, in the connection between IPC and management, what role should the two be playing? Because ultimately, a big decant like this seems like a big decision for an infection director, a lead infection control doctor to make. So where should the line be drawn in terms of management? Who ultimately makes these decisions?
Okay. Well, your description was there's nothing wrong with the description, but I didn't recognise, I've not come across that scenario as you described it. If that scenario was going to happen, I would expect some key individual or individuals in the IMT process to be part of the other board, the managers you refer to it as, because otherwise, how can the managers make an informed decision, a truly informed decision, based on the facts? If that wasn't the case, then I have a fundamental problem with that, knowing nothing else. So the reality, to answer your question, is that the whole point, if you have a robust system, remember we've got these problem assessment groups, PAGs, deciding, is this an instance of sufficient concern to constitute an IMT? Yes, we've got an IMT. If you've got a functioning system, then the IMT should be capable of managing the incident or not, and needing to, in this case, escalate it. And then the normal route of escalation there would be, if the DIPSI wasn't part of the IMT, then the ICD, infection control doctor, usually, or the lead, whoever's leading the infection prevention and control team, would communicate with the DIPSI, who is usually is required, according to national documents, to be a board member. So then it's then a board decision to have another group created in between IMT and board. Seems odd to me, and that's what I said I didn't really understand.
I think we might have a difference between England and Scotland here. So because
Possibly.
We have evidence that the infection control manager is not an infection control nurse or an infection control doctor.
Okay.
And that his replacement as director of infection prevention control is an infection control nurse. And that the board level responsibility in the Scottish system sits with the HIA infection lead, who at that point was the medical director. So that seems a very different system to the one you're describing.
It is, yes.
Right. In that case, I'll stop asking you about the English system at this stage. Thank you very much for that. I've got one final question before we have a short break to see if there are any further questions, which is, we asked ourselves a question as an inquiry, which I'm not going to ask you the whole thing because that's possibly unfair, but I'll tell you what it is. It's our key question 4, which is there a link, and if so, in what way and to what extent, between patient infections and identified unsafe features of the water and ventilation systems? And I'm not going to ask you that question because you don't know what the features of the system are. But to what extent do you, as a panel, say there is any link between the environment in the Royal Hospital Children's and the patients, and the infections in the patients of your case notes review cohort?
The evidence suggests strongly to me, and I believe us, that the clustering in time, person and place of these organisms, and two or three in particular, or two or three species in particular, are strongly suggestive of a link between aspects of the environment, almost certainly waterborne, and infections, some of the infections that occurred in children.
Thank you. Well, I've got no more questions for Professor Wilcox, but it may be that people in the room have questions. I wonder if we might take a short minute to find out.
Before we do that, Professor Wilcox, can I come back to your use of the word iterative, or perhaps the phrase iterative process? And you used it in about the context of ascribing possible, probable, and variations on that. Could you just maybe just tease out so that I could, as fully as I can, sort of understand your your process of reasoning or analysis that you described using the word iterative?
So when one starts an exercise like this, and I've never done a case review as large as this, and I don't think any of us had, we know the principles, we know how to carry out the review, so we knew sort of the pieces of the jigsaw. I guess the bit we were less confident about was how to ascribe level and describe levels of certainty regarding a conclusion. Environment, yes, no, to put it bluntly. So we attempted to divide up our levels of certainty in around the word possible and probable, probably to a greater extent than we would do on a day-to-day basis when we're trying to decide, have we got an outbreak, a cluster of infections or not? Is the environment involved, yes or not? And I think I've explained why we took that process. It was so that when you do the first case you're doing, we split these cases up. The first, let's say, 5 cases I did, there's going to be 5 more and 5 more and 5 more. If you don't have granularity, more granularity rather than less with your first, when you're reviewing your first cases, then you potentially lost an opportunity. What we didn't know in real time is that we were going to have to go back and review those cases twice more. We were assuming we'd be doing this once. So I think that was another reason why we had more granularity, if that's the right word, in our scoring system, for want of a better term, for degree of certainty. And we, as I've said, we had to review the cases twice more. And then we became more confident, having done this 84 times 3, that in what we believed to be a probable versus only a possible. And that's why we felt it was reasonable to coalesce, contract some of those subcategories of certainty into a simple, possible and probable. That was the iterative process I was referring to.
The word iterative suggests to me, at least, a taking of steps along a pathway. And I was trying just to ensure that I mean, if that was how you were using the word, in order to help me understand your mental processes,
yes,
what these steps and what that pathway might be.
So to me, though, an iterative process is not a pathway that's laid out in front of you, which you can describe now into the future. It's a pathway which you travel down and learn as you go along. That's what I mean by an iterative process. I think it's possible semantics, but the difference is interpretation. But that's why I was using the word iterative.
Sort of an accretion of insight or knowledge.
Yeah, it's a learning process. Perhaps I should have said learning. Iterative was maybe too inflated, but I still think if I said that to my colleagues to describe what we did, I think they wouldn't have taken issue with that. I think it's perhaps your expertise coming at it from that word versus mine.
Thank you. Just as a matter of administration, when it's in my mind, do we have a bundle number for the protocol, or?
We do. It's bundle 27, volume 6, document 24. And the page number, I don't know, but the new version has been put onto the Objective Connect spaces for all the core participants, and it'll need to be updated on my Lord's laptop.
Right. I asked because, I mean, I have it.
I have a horrible fear that all the remaining page numbers after document 24 are now going to be out, but yes.
Right. Well, I'll pursue that. Professor, if, as Mr. McIntosh has said, I need to check with the room as to whether there's any more questions. So if I could ask you to return to the witness room, and I hope to be back in about 10 minutes.
That's fine. Thank you.
Ms McIntosh?
I have no questions from colleagues here or remotely in respect to Professor Wilcox.
Thank you, Ms McIntosh. Thank you for waiting, Professor Wilcox. I understand there's no further questions that we would wish to put to you, which means you're free to go. But before you go, can I thank you for your attendance today, but also in the work involved in providing us with a written statement, which of course is another part of your evidence. So thank you very much indeed, but you're now free to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We resume tomorrow at 10.
10 with Professor Stevens, who sat
with
down for the whole
Professor
day.
Stevens. Well, if I can wish everyone a good afternoon, we will see each other tomorrow, all being well.